So you're here to talk about your PhD research into carnivorous plants.
Yes, that's right.
Right. And we've got carnivorous plants here in New Zealand?
Yes, people are often actually very surprised when I tell them what I'm doing, and people are always saying, "Oh, we have carnivorous plants here."
Right.
And in New Zealand, we actually have two kinds of carnivorous plants.
Right.
We have the bladderworts, which is the genus Utricularia,
Right.
and we have the Drosera, which is the sundews.
Right.
And I'm not going to be talking about the bladderworts because they
Right.
were much too difficult to study. I'll
Right.
just be talking about the sundews.
Right. So
Yep.
sundews are what? Are they a large plant, little plant?
No, well, it varies. We have 7 species here in New Zealand.
Right.
6 of them are native, and 1 of them is endemic, which means you won't find it anywhere else in the world.
Right.
And they range in size from very, very small, size of my pinky fingernail,
Right.
to about 1 meter in height.
That's the whole plant, the size of a fingernail.
Yes, that's right.
Right.
So I brought some plants here to show a few
Oh.
different species. You can see that the trap types vary quite a bit.
Yeah.
The species Drosera, their traps are much like fly paper, very sticky, and they
Right.
have these tentacles that have, it's called mucilage, which is just the sticky substance that
Right.
traps the insects. And so here we have Drosera binata, and this has forked leaves, so it's got 2 forks here.
And these little hairs, are they the sticky bits?
Yes, these little red tentacles, they're supposed to be the sticky bits.
Right.
And as this plant gets older and bigger, this will fork off into 2 more bits, which will fork off into 2 more, and then this whole plant, the leaf structure itself, can get up to 1 meter in height.
Oh, yeah.
And then these are the flowering stalks, and these can grow even taller than that.
Right. And presumably they're trapping insects, are they?
Yes, that's right.
Do they eat anything else? Like slugs or?
No, I haven't seen any slugs, and actually, I've seen caterpillars that have gone onto the leaves but have not been trapped, which is very interesting.
Right.
But as you can see, these are quite small plants.
Yes.
Here is
Tiny.
this is spatulata, and it has just a basal rosette, and that's all the trap right there, just
Right.
right on the ground.
Uh-huh.
And so it's not going to be capturing any big flying insect.
No.
This kind of trap is going to collect mostly small sandflies and ants and things.
Sandflies has got to be a good thing.
Yes, I was very, very happy when I was in the field and they were capturing all those sandflies.
Right.
Now, in other countries, there are other kinds of carnivorous plants that have larger traps, like the big pitcher plants. And in those traps, people have found larger animals like small rodents, mice, and frogs and things. But in New Zealand,
Nothing like that here.
no, our plants are quite small, so
Right.
they wouldn't capture much more than, the wandering fly or a moth.
Right.
But I have seen the alpine the alpine grasshoppers,
Right.
which are quite large, and I've seen those stuck in some very small traps. So the sticky mucilage is very, very strong.
Right. And they're gobbling up insects because they're living in nutrient-poor environments? Or?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes. So these plants live in places where a lot of other plants can't live. Usually very, very waterlogged, peaty, nutrient-poor soils.
Right.
And they do this because they can get their nutrients from the insects or whatever their prey is,
Right, so
instead of from the
swamps.
soil. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
dark
right.
swamps.
Pretty much the swamps or tarns or just marshy areas
Right.
are usually where you're going to find them.
Right.
Yep. Now, I brought this one along because I thought this would be a good example of the traps. You can see them really well.
Yeah.
And I wanted to point out, though, that this is not one of the 6 native species,
Oh, okay.
Drosera, but they do very, very well here, which is probably because they're not native. And this I've actually heard has become a bit weedy. And everybody that I know who has gotten one of these plants from a glass house,
Right.
when I go to their house or wherever they've got them, they have tons of them because they they reproduce so easily and they love it in the glass house or wherever you put them.
So how do they spread around like that? Do they grow a seed that...
Yeah, so you can see here, this is the flowering stalk, and each one of these was a flower. And all of these flowers have opened, and each one of these will be a fruit that has probably, I'm guessing, around 100 seeds in it.
Okay.
And so from each one of these flowers, you could potentially get, 50 to 100 new plants from that. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to demonstrate here just how a fly might get caught onto a trap.
Yeah.
And so we'll pretend that this guy is alive and flying. Don't worry, he's not. I found him in my windowsill, so no harm done. He's going to fly along. Drosera have what's called plant or active traps.
Right.
And so if you've heard of a Venus flytrap, and they're the ones that, look like this, and then a fly comes in and they snap closed.
Yeah.
Well, Drosera do a very similar thing to that. These little tentacles will all start to very slowly fold over the fly.
Right.
And then that sticky mucilage also has digestive enzymes in it, and that will break down the fly and turn it into nutrients that can then be absorbed into the leaf. Right, so I'll just get these out of the way for now. So the interesting thing about Drosera is that they don't just use insects for food, they also use them for pollination.
Ah, so they're going to eat something that comes along to pollinate it.
Yes, that's right. And so that has big consequences because plants need pollination in order to produce seeds or fruits, like the apples and oranges that we eat, or the fruits. And so,
and here's the flowers.
That's right.
Yes.
And so I thought that I could show you what pollination is, or those who may not know exactly. So I'm going to do a little demonstration because I think that's the easiest thing to do.
Right.
So if you could just hold that.
Okay.
Yep, that's perfect. And I'll hold mine. So pollination is really simply the process of transferring the male component of the flower, which is the pollen, to the female component, which is the stigma.
Right.
And on these flowers, you can see that the pollen is going to be on the anther, which is the orange bits here, and the female part, the stigma, is just right here in the middle. Now, these parts can vary hugely in shape, color, size, whatever, depending on the flower. But luckily for me, this Drosera flower is very simple, so it's not too out of control.
So that's actually a Drosera flower?
Yes, this is Drosera arcturi.
Oh, it's a pretty flower.
Yes, they are pretty. They're not too terribly showy. They're like a lot of other New Zealand flowers where they're quite simple and white. So the way that this pollination works is we've got some pollen on the anthers, right? And then we're going to have a pollinator come along, whether it be a fly or whatever. This is Betty.
It's not Buzzy Bee, is it?
No, it's not Buzzy Bee. This is Betty, and she can be a representation of any kind of pollinator that you like.
All right.
And so Betty is going to come down, and she's going to be munching on some pollen. So she's going to be eating pollen. And in the process, she's going to pick some pollen up, and it's going to stick to her somewhere. Okay? Then she's going to fly over, and she'll say, oh, there's some more pollen on this plant over here. Okay? And so while she's eating away over here, we're going to have to redo that one, sorry.
The pollen sticks.
Betty lost her pollen sticker.
Oh, right.
All right, so we'll start over. All right, so what's going to happen is you have this pollinator come along, Betty here, and she's going to be wanting to eat some of this pollen that's on this flower. So she's going to be attracted to the pollen. And while she's eating, she's going to pick up a pollen grain. It's going to be stuck to her body.
She's very clever.
Yes, she is. And she's going to come over and she's going to try to eat some pollen from another flower. Thank you.
There we go.
And in the process, she's going to deposit that pollen onto the stigma of another flower.
Right.
Now, assuming that these flowers are coming from two different plants, this is called outcrossing. And once that has occurred, now the fruit can produce seeds and the plant can reproduce.
Right. And without that, there wouldn't be any fruit.
That's right. Without that, normally there wouldn't be any fruit.
No seeds.
That's right.
Right. Okay.
Yep. So I can take that from you. Thank you.
So what happens if the plant eats the pollinator before it pollinates? No pollination.
Yes, this is a very good question.
Right.
And it's one that people have been studying for quite a while. The idea was introduced in about 1995, I think. And essentially what would happen is the pollination process could be disrupted. So there are two things that could happen, and I'll just use these two spatulatas because I have two of the same kind. Okay? So here comes Betty again, right?
Yeah.
Now there are two things that could happen. The first thing is that before Betty even gets to the first flower, she, for whatever reason, is attracted or bumbles along and gets caught.
Yeah.
Yep. So there's no pollen transfer whatsoever. The second thing that could happen is Betty comes along and she eats her pollen, she gets some pollen, and then before she gets to the next one, now she got sidetracked and then she went and she got stuck in the trap.
Right.
So again, the pollen is not transferred, the process is not complete.
Yeah.
Now, if this happens quite a lot, it can actually inhibit the reproduction of an entire population.
Yeah.
And this is known as the pollinator-prey conflict.
Right.
Yep.
So how do the plants actually solve it? Is that what you're working on, is it?
That's right. Well, I came to New Zealand because I saw some really cool pictures and thought, I'm going to study and go to New Zealand.
Uh-huh.
And I had also already had this idea in mind that I wanted to study the pollinator-prey conflict because I found it so intriguing that plants could still be reproducing even though they're eating the things that are supposed to be reproducing them. And so I came here and I started looking at something that a lot of people actually haven't looked at with carnivorous plants. Because what's really exciting about carnivorous plants is that they eat insects, right? And so everyone tends to focus on the traps because that's what makes these plants cool.
Yeah.
But what I thought was really cool about them was actually the flowers, because that's what's causing, that's where the reproduction occurs.
Right.
And so I had this idea it's not just my idea, but what if the plants didn't need pollinators? What if they could reproduce without depending on insects for pollination? If they could do that, then they could eat those pollinators, and it would probably be better for them because they'll get the nutrients from those insects.
Yeah.
Yes.
And has anything been discovered about that?
Yes. Well, there's this idea of selfing or self-pollination. And so that's where plants don't depend on insects for pollination because they can actually do it themselves. And so the concept is, the idea is, I'll just show you again. Here's this flower. Okay, and we have this pollen that's on this anther. And selfing is essentially the pollen from that flower going to its stigma. So its own pollen goes to its own stigma. And so no outside pollen comes to do that. And this can happen in two ways. One, while Betty is over here eating away, she knocks the pollen into the own stigma, which is called facilitated selfing. And the other way is that the plant itself actually has mechanisms that cause the anthers and the stigmas to touch. And so these anthers will actually bend towards the stigma and touch it with their own self-pollen.
Right.
That's right. And so in this way, the plants no longer have to depend on insects for pollination.
Right. But wouldn't there be a problem with sort of an inbreeding, or wouldn't the population just turn into a clone population?
Right, just one type of gene, yeah. Well, there is potential for that, and I'm sure you've heard of inbreeding depression. And in animals, most animals have developed ways to prevent selfing from happening.
Yeah.
You need some sort of partner involved, so you have a mix of genes.
Yes.
And the thing is that depending on insects for pollination can be really risky because...
Well, especially if they're eating them.
Well, that's right. In this case, if they're eating the pollinators, then that can create a pollen limitation.
Yeah.
But also, like out in my study sites, I was doing my studies up in the mountains at Arthur's Pass.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it was very beautiful. But 3 of my sites, well, one of my sites was subalpine, so it was just below the tree line. And 2 of my sites were alpine, so they were above the tree line. And in those areas, the weather can be extremely variable and really harsh. So there were, a few days of the summer where you could go out, it's a perfectly sunny day, crystal clear, no wind, 45 degrees, and insects buzzing everywhere.
Yeah.
But for most of the summer, you could have a range between really windy and -2, frost, snow. I can't tell you the number of times I went out and it was snowing.
Yeah.
And those conditions are not ideal for a lot of insects. They just can't fly in those conditions. And so if a plant is in one of those areas and they're depending on pollination, then that can be very risky, particularly for Drosera, because what I found is two of the species that I've looked at, Drosera arcturi and the endemic Stenopetala, each plant only produces one flower for the entire year, and that one flower opens for 1 to 3 days, and that's it. So if it opens and it's not one of those bright, sunny, crystal clear days, then that's exactly it. So in that particular instance, it is very risky to depend on pollinators. But going back to the inbreeding depression, there are costs to selfing. So you can't get away scot-free. And
so what do you find? Weird-shaped plants doing funny things?
You can find mutations. I found lots of flowers that would have extra petals, or normally for arcturi, for instance, which is this flower here, they normally have 5 petals, 5 anthers, and a few stigma lobes. And sometimes I would go out and I'd have a flower that have 13 petals and 10 anthers, and so you find some that are mutated, which is evidence that there is some sort of something happening with the genes out there. So if you have outcrossing, what happens is you get more genes in the mix. And the reason why that's good is because when you have outcrossing, the offspring of that occurrence is going to have genes from the mother and genes from whatever other donors there were of the pollen, right? If you have just a selfed plant, then you have only the genes of the mother. And this can be okay in a lot of cases. But what tends to happen is that when you have more genetic diversity in a plant, it seems that they can cope better with being sick, or they have less chance of getting sick, or they can deal with changing conditions. So let's just say, like what happened to me last year. We've got plants that have, say we have some self offspring, and it only has the mother's genes. And the mother's genes were good at dealing with wet conditions of the soil, but maybe not so good at dealing with really dry conditions of the soil. So the next season comes along and the offspring are up, and all of a sudden we get a drought. Well, those plants don't have the genes to cope with that change, and so they all die. Whereas maybe some plants might have gotten that resistance to drought from a father plant somewhere else. And so those with more genes have a higher chance of surviving.
Much more likely to last long term.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Wow, clever wee plants, eh?
Yes. Can you see that? Okay. Plants can also get around, depending on insects, for pollination by reproducing asexually, which means there's no pollination involved at all in the process. And so what will happen is the plant can send out shoots underground, and new plants will pop up from that. So in this case here, I brought a spatulata, and in the middle, just in here, is a whole lot of pretty much sludge. Now that used to be the main plant, and it got sick. And the plant just sort of died. And I left it alone for about 2 months, just gave up on it, and came back one day, and it had about 7 new little plants growing all around it, which shows me that it had sent out some new shoots underground, and new plants had come up.
And how far into your studies have you got?
I'm pretty much at the end now. So I'm just writing up. I had 2 field seasons, and it was mostly spending a lot of time sitting out in the rain, hoping for a little bit of sun to come out so I could see some pollinators. Yeah.
And I'm sure people will be interested to maybe even start growing some of these plants at home. Is there anything we can tell them about that?
Yes. Well, first of all, the plants are very difficult to grow. So if you're thinking about going out and collecting them from the wild, you should think again, because you'll probably not be successful. I talked to one hobbyist who's been trying to grow arcturi from seed for 16 years and has not been successful. And I myself have grown arcturi for 2 years in the glass house, but I brought one with you to show you how successful it's been. This is after 2 years.
That's huge.
It's enormous, isn't it? That's right. And this is one out of maybe I'd say probably around 300 seeds that I've planted.
Right.
And this is one of the most successful ones.
Yeah.
So
not easy.
No, it's not easy.
And don't translocate because they don't like it.
Yeah. Well, this is the binata, and you had mentioned earlier that you'd seen these in the wild a lot larger.
Yes.
This one has been transplanted and it's just barely hung on. It's about maybe 4 months old. So trying to grow them from seed doesn't work very well, and trying to grow them, by transplanting will probably not work very well. I mean, the bottom line is, if you don't live on a mountaintop, in a bog, or both, they're not going to grow in your garden. So we might as well just leave them where they are. And besides that, you need permission from Doc and Iwi before you even think about, trying to take them.
Right. But they are available in the shops, but not these particular native ones.
I think that there may be some people who do sell natives.
Right.
The spatulata, like I showed before, tend to grow pretty easily.
Right.
And so you could probably get some there. This Drosera capensis, which I'll show you again, this one I think is pretty readily available, and is probably one of the most common Drosera that is being sold. But again, like I said, these are known to be quite weedy, but they will do well if they stay in your kitchen window or something. They will do well.
Right.
Yes.
So long as you don't mind them all through your veggie garden.
Well, I don't know unless you keep your veggie garden like a swamp, they might not do too well there either.
Right.
Yeah. So the other species of New Zealand Drosera that I didn't bring along today are Auriculata and Peltata. And Peltata is restricted to the north, but Auriculata and Peltata look very, very similar to the naked eye, unless you have your eye tuned. And then the other one that I didn't bring was Pygmaea, which I mentioned is the size of my pinky fingernail.
Yeah.
And then the last one, which is the endemic Stenopetala. And that one is quite cool because it has leaves that are shaped kind of like little teaspoons.
Right. What's this book you've got here?
Oh, that's right. So I wanted to mention that if you were curious about finding them, just to see them or, take photographs or whatever, there are some places where you can go to get information where to find them. And I would say first what you should do is you should start with this book. This is Bruce Salmon's Carnivorous Plants of New Zealand.
Right.
And it's a great book. He has a lot of very detailed drawings and photographs of not just Drosera, but also the bladderworts that I mentioned earlier. And he tells you sort of the distribution across the country.
Right.
And also some specific sites are laid out.
So like all plants, they have their own ranges within New Zealand.
Yeah, that's right. And some of them are quite restricted, and some of them are more widespread.
Right.
Now, the one thing that I did want to mention is that these plants used to be more widespread than they are. So they used to be you could find them at a lot of lowland sites where marshes or swamps would exist. And in fact, at one point, not too terribly long ago, they used to be here in Hagley Park.
Right.
And the problem has been that wetlands have been drained for agriculture and for housing developments and such. And if wetlands do exist anymore, they're often surrounded by paddocks, and those paddocks are going to have a lot of nitrogen in the soil, and that runoff will go into the swampy area and will allow other plants to grow very easily and outcompete the Drosera. So I think they're a lot harder to find in the lowland sites than they used to be. I think they're mostly restricted now to the higher elevation sites. In Northland, though, which is where one species, Peltata, is restricted to, you can find them growing in mats along the roadside. But those soils around there are known to be quite nutrient poor and peaty and very much like clay. But you can find them at lower elevation sites in the Northland area.
Do we think we might be losing them? Has it got that bad? Or?
Well, what I would really like to do, or have somebody else do, is I'd like to look at the distribution, say, maybe 30 or so years ago, and see where they were, and then now do another survey and see where they are today. And that will give us a better idea of what the population sizes are now. Do we still have the same number of Drosera, but they're just in different locations?
Right.
Or do we actually have quite a few less plants than we used to? Yeah, and these plants have been known to be really important in that they've been considered to be indicator species, and that means that they're very sensitive. And so indicator species, because they're so sensitive, will be the first ones to be affected and show some sort of distress when an environment is changing.
Yeah.
And so these guys could be used to see, if, say, a wetland, if the nutrients are changing quite a bit, or if the water levels are changing quite a bit, and they will be one of the first ones to go. And so they can be very useful in conservation, but I don't think that we have so many around anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
We'll have to keep a look at. You don't often see them.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why I wanted to come here today, actually, was just to show people that first, we do have carnivorous plants here in New Zealand, and that they are really neat, and that they are very small. So if you're going to look for them, you have to tune your eye. And the other thing is that carnivorous plants just show you one more reason why wetlands are so incredible. They may not have the highest biodiversity in the world, but they're really important, and they have lots of really neat things in them, and carnivorous plants are one of those. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.